Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the monster. Metaphors in horror movies have always gone together quite well, but they're usually things that you don't really notice unless you're looking at the film on a deeper level. There's usually a time where I'm explaining to someone, hey, there's something deeper going on with It Follows, or even though it's not a horror movie, but a monster movie, Godzilla, or Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, or things like that. And then you explain to someone and go, oh, right, I just saw it for the stabby stab and blood and stuff. And the monster, it's not hidden. It's not one of those things where you go, oh, there's this relationship thing, drama going on within this horror movie. The relationship drama is more important than the horror movie element. Now that's interesting, but the premise of this movie is that a little girl and her alcoholic mother are driving to her dad's house because they aren't really getting along and she just wants to get rid of the daughter. And so their relationship is very strained, and then they think they hit a wolf, but it's pretty clear that a monster is in the wolves and is trying to slowly attack them as they wait for a tow truck and an ambulance to hopefully pick them up, and as the monster slowly teases them. And then as that's going on, which sounds like a cool grindhousey kind of simple B video on demand, which is how I saw it, and I think most people are seeing this through streaming on video on demand, I believe. It's a nice premise for one of those. Just that premise. And that's why I saw this movie, because I liked the trailer. I thought the trailer was really cool, and I saw it months ago, but it struck a chord with me. I was like, oh cool, I need to see the monster when it comes out. So then, after seeing the monster, when you're watching it, it keeps cutting to these flashbacks of the relationship between the mother and the daughter, and the mother's various problems with alcoholism, how the daughter's had to witness this, or her throwing up late at night for drinking too much, and all her problems with alcohol and all their fights, and how she doesn't want her mom around a lot of the time because she embarrasses her, probably because of the drinking, but also because they don't really get along and they yell at each other a lot and embarrass each other. And it keeps cutting to that as we see them have to deal with trying to survive with this monster. That idea works very well as you're setting the characters up, because you're like, okay, this is who they are. In a simple genre sense, you do very little. You see the guy, pick up his cigarettes, and underneath the cigarettes there's like past due bills. You're like, oh, he's having financial trouble, and also smokes cigarettes, I guess. And then two things about him. The cigarettes thing are less important, but you get the kind of character that person is. And in this, it keeps doing that throughout the whole movie. And it kind of overbears the whole thing, because every time I sort of get into the monster part of it, which is the titular monster, I guess, it keeps cutting away to like flashbacks. And although I will say that it worked at the beginning and at the very end, most of it just kind of hurt the tension of it. And it's kind of like an experiment in horror and emphasizing something that no one would emphasize. Bringing up to people that Halloween has a lot of interesting relationships between the teen girls in it. Most people go, oh, right. Or with Jaws, you're like, oh, there's an interesting character dynamic between the guys in the boat. Oh, right. And it's like, this movie takes all those things that you have to be reminded of, even though it's obviously essential to it and why you enjoyed the movie so much, but it's not something you're like thinking about every day or something like that. It's something that's hidden, kind of like an important part of a meal that you don't realize is so important, and then you have a hamburger instead of a cheeseburger and you go, oh shit, I like cheeseburgers. Although this does play within its simple genre premise, and it's very good at doing that when it does it, and it's interesting what it's doing, I often found it an experiment in something that didn't really need to ever be done. It's like, that's cool, but there's sort of a reason they emphasize the horror parts. I think this is a good movie. It's just a failed experiment of a good movie, I guess you could say. And it shows a lot of promise from this director, who I haven't seen his other stuff. I think he did The Strangers, Brian Bertino. He's kind of someone who you're like, you're not amazing, but you're experimented and did such interesting things. I'm just curious. Like, I see another movie that had a cool premise from him just because I'm curious what he will do. Just the idea of him surprises me. He's like more of an interesting director from just having only seen this movie than like a director that I'm like, oh man, I have to see something from this guy. He's someone who I go, well, it's an interesting idea. I think there's probably a way you could do something like this. I don't think this was the way to do it. You don't know what the fuck this monster is. The monster's done in practical effects that remind you of those dog things in Ghostbusters. Were they the gatekeeper? I know they're not Zool. Whatever those fucking things were. Or Rick Moranis. Anyway, the dogs at the end of Ghostbusters. Doesn't matter. It looks sort of like that, not just spoilers, I guess, but you don't see it for most of the movie. And if you're playing under the rules of Jaws or Cat People or The Blair Witch, the reason you're not showing it is to build tension, and you're kind of usually in those three examples, it's kind of built to heighten the suspense. Really finely made filmmaking. We're talking about Jaws and Cat People in particular. Those are two incredibly well-made films made by really great directors and cinematographers and editors, and it shows like the amazing thing filmmaking can do, which is not show you and play with you as an audience. Just have a little thing go on, you go, oh my god, what is that? And The Monster sort of gets into that and isn't technically a bad made film. I wouldn't say like the cinematography is done by Julie Kirkwood. I would say she's a good cinematographer. It's almost like the director didn't really know how to use all those elements. There's some cinematographers like Roger Deakins or somebody, he's gonna hit it out of the park every time, but there's certain people who know how to use a DP and they're almost better because of their direction, or like, you know, how Roger Deakins works with the Coens, he's always amazing. And when he works with like everyone else, maybe sort of Sam Mendes, but is an exception, but everyone else, it doesn't quite work the same way. And this is like a way where I'm like, this is a well-made film. I would not say anyone who works on this film is a bad craftsman. I think they're very good, but how he uses them, he's not really playing with that suspense in such a way. He clearly cares more about this mother-daughter relationship. Using that in this kind of grindhousey thing and doing it in kind of an interesting way, I kind of understand why this wasn't put into theaters, because it's kind of a weird film, because I don't think it's really right for the art house, but I don't think it's right for the multiplex, so it's almost like perfect for video on demand. Not to shit on it, I actually think it's an interesting film, and it shows kind of the interesting avenues you can go into with horror. The script isn't entirely there, the direction isn't entirely there, but the idea of the monster, I think, is an interesting that makes you go, oh, that's why you do that. But I was also thinking, maybe this is the kind of idea that someone else could take and make a much more interesting movie with. That was really dicky, but it's true. It's the kind of idea that, like, you know, someone could do something interesting with this kind of an idea. It's just the monster doesn't quite do it. I know lots of people really like Zoe Kazan as the mom in this, Kathy. I didn't think she was horrible, but I just felt she was kind of miscast. As much as she tried to do it, it just didn't feel as believable. I really very rarely attack an actor for believability. I never really feel that way about most actors. And I like Zoe Kazan, and I like that this isn't a role that you normally see her in. And I found that interesting that she would do something like this, but it didn't really work for me. And I feel like that's kind of an important role. I wish they had gotten a stronger actress. I felt that while I was watching the film. I later read after finishing the film that Elizabeth Moss was supposed to be in it and was announced to star in it, and that didn't work out for whatever reason. I really wish it had been Elizabeth Moss. I feel like she could have done it. Maybe not. You know, this movie has flaws already, so I don't know if an actress like that could have really just completely saved it or something. But I think Zoe Kazan did a good job. I don't really want to see her in too much horror after this. It was an interesting kind of different role for her to play. She does highlight how much of a character actress she really is, which I think character actors are usually a lot stronger and more versatile than lead actors, and I think seeing a character actor take on this role was probably a good idea. It's kind of like most of the things in this movie. It was an interesting idea, it just didn't quite work out. I wouldn't mind seeing Zoe Kazan in more of a supporting role in a horror movie. I just didn't think it necessarily worked for her in a lead in this one. And the little girl, Lizzie Ella Ballantine, was really good, and Christy Lumiere compared her to Reese Witherspoon, and I agree with that. I don't know about Reese Witherspoon, but in terms of being a promising young actress, I can definitely see that, and she was very, very good. I don't think this is a bad movie. I think it's a good film, but it's good emphasis on interesting. Sometimes there's certain movies that just make you think about why genre does a certain thing. And The Monster did, but it made me kind of go, well, I mean, I don't know. I think in a weaker horror year, you might emphasize this more, or a weaker horror period. I don't think we necessarily are in that period. But one of the things I love about the video on demand horror and action stuff that's going on right now is it can do much more interesting things than multiplexes. However, I think as a genre piece, I don't think it fulfills what it's trying to do. And as an art house thing, I don't think it fulfills what it's trying to do. It kind of paves its own path, which is like, hey, good on you, because not a lot of movies could necessarily do that the way The Monster can. I think The Monster just like steadfastly goes after what it's trying to do, do, and even though it's not necessarily working, it does it anyway, and I think that's commendable. I think this is kind of a commendable horror movie, but just not like a good one, and one that's more interesting and intriguing, but not a scary one or one that you would like really recommend to people. It's also like not entirely multiplex, and it's not entirely art house. It's kind of somewhere in between, doing its own interesting thing, twisting in the wind and not even sure where it's going to twist itself. And I think that's probably the monster's problem, is because its whole theory doesn't really commit to itself. The monster isn't really her mom. It's just like they have this bad relationship and then they fight a monster. Shouldn't that have all been taken care of in the beginning instead of going throughout? And then if someone goes, well, why don't we have it going throughout? And then you're like, no, I think we were good the way it was, but I'm glad you tried, I guess. Good effort in terms of the monster. Although I think the flashback towards the very last flashback I thought was pretty good, and I think it shows, I guess, the same idea as like melancholia is, if you've been through more trauma, it's easier for you to deal with stressful situations, and I guess that sort of works, but it kind of gets lost in the mix, as does everything. But the monster looks cool, and in terms of some horror elements and kind of hidden horror stuff, it does sort of what it needs to do, but frankly I think a lot of these elements needed to be directed a lot better, and its kind of theory unto itself needed to sort of connect in a way that this movie never really does. But I think the monster shows an interesting horror director and an interesting and intriguing horror movie, but maybe an interesting and intriguing thing that we maybe really didn't need to do, because it makes you realize why the genre was doing certain things within its format and its structure, and makes you sort of realize why those things are the way they are. But as for this movie itself, it just kind of reaffirms why certain structures are the way they are and why you shouldn't probably break them and make things like this. So if you've seen The Monster and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.